Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 13. The next few days were extremely hectic, and it seemed like every time that Rael and Scylla attempted to get a few minutes of alone time, another photo shoot or interview or concert would get in the way. The only free time available for them to be alone was in the middle of the night. However, Garrett had Scylla's schedule so jam-packed that 9 out of 10 times the musician fell asleep in the limo on the way back to the mansion. As Byron and Rael sat in the back of the limo on the way from another concert, they both looked at each other and then back to the brunette who had literally fallen asleep mid-sentence. Her charge safely resting, Rael let her own head drop back against the leather seat cushion as she recounted the recent times they'd spent together. They managed to have lunch together in the mansion one afternoon, and another chance to play together in the brunette's studio early one morning. There were a couple of other moments here and there, but no real time to connect like they had at Rael's house. As she sat there, their most recent encounter came to mind. It had been a particularly chilly morning a few days ago, while Rael shivered along the walking paths doing her security checks, and she's almost ran straight into the brunette on a morning jog. Scylla had looked incredible, her cheeks rosy from the cold, her breath coming out in white puffs in the cold fall air. "Good morning," Scylla said, still moving in place, keeping up her heart rate and trying to stay warm in a running suit. "Good morning yourself," Rael had answered, smiling at the brunette. "Run with me? In this weather?" Scylla, being her typical self, had just nodded and laughed. "Come on, live a little." Rael had quirked a brow. "Warm me up afterwards?" "Absolutely, if you can keep up." With that, Scylla ran off and Rael laughed, running to catch up with the brunette. And so they had jogged a good portion of the footpaths, and ended up back at the guest house about an hour later, both panting and laughing, and in Rael's case, still fucking freezing. As they stumbled through the door, Scylla reached for the blonde and slid her hands on Rael's hoodie. The cold of Scylla's hands on Rael's stomach made her shiver, and shivers turned to shudders, as Scylla teased at Rael's nipples. Rael dipped her head down, capturing the musician's lips, and reached out a hand to slam the guest house door. Rael shifted uncomfortably in the limo, snapping back to reality and realizing she was getting herself worked up for nothing. She looked at the sleeping beauty across from her now, and then glanced over at Byron, who looked just as tired as she felt. "When does this stop?" Rael asked Scylla's brother. "She's exhausted." Byron looked at Rael and shrugged. "She's booked till Fort Salem at the end of the month, and then she's got a couple Christmas concerts scheduled, and one around New Year's Eve, but that's about it until January." "So we just need to make it through Halloween and she gets a break?" Rael asked and looked at the still dozing brunette, hoping that the woman could make it that long. "Yup." "So, what's this festival thing tomorrow?" "Oh, it's a big to-do," Byron said. "Lots of hopeful screenwriters, actresses, and wannabe film producers hobnobbing with rich celebrities." Rael rolled her eyes. "Sounds like a ball." Byron laughed. "Oh yeah, it's a good time. This particular festival is all about the horror genre, so of course they have it close to Halloween. There's always a big party complete with costumes and people in cosplay before the film starts. And Scylla likes it? Raelle asks. She's got the impression Scylla would much rather be in her studio than be at a big party with people running around in masks and watching horror films. It's not really her thing, no. But one of our old friends, Beth, is the artistic director, and this year they are going to show some of her work, so I know she's been nagging at Scylla to come. Raelle answered. The limo pulled up to the house, and Byron roused his sister from her slumber. As they got out of the limo, Scylla said her goodnight to the bodyguard and gave her a kiss on the cheek. Raelle watched the Ramshorn siblings as they walked to the house and saw Byron as he dipped his head and whispered something to his sister as they reached the steps. Byron walked up the steps and inside the house, pausing to give Raelle a small wave. But Scylla stopped and turned back to Raelle. She called out to the blonde, "Call over to the house tomorrow about an hour before we have to go to the festival, and I'll send Moffat over there to help you get dressed." Raelle's brow quirked. "I can dress myself just fine, Scylla." "And I can undress you just as easily," the brunette teased, and then yawned despite herself. "Seriously, some sort of costume is mandatory, even if it's just a mask. She can help you figure something out." Raelle nodded. "Okay, Syl. Good night." As she headed to the guest house, she pondered what Scylla would wear to the festival. Raelle decided she would consent to a mask, but she wasn't wearing a costume. Although she'd been given access to the guest list for the party and everyone checked out, there was still a chance that there would be a last-minute addition, and she would need to be ready to fulfill her duties as needed. She rolled her eyes at the idea of calling someone over to professionally get her ready for the festival, but she didn't want her appearance to make Scylla look bad in front of the people that she knew. After she showered, she slipped on a robe and made the call. Moffat arrived about 10 minutes later carrying 2 large cases, and Porter was lugging a box behind her. Raelle took the cases from Moffat and Porter put the box down by the door. He offered Raelle a small smile. "Aren't you going tonight?" Raelle asked. "Yeah, but I'll probably just stay in the limo with Helen, so no costume for me." He gave the girls a nod and headed back out into the cold. Moffat looked at Raelle and grinned. "So, let's go look at your closet." Raelle walked with Glory back into the bedroom and opened her closet. Immediately, Moffat moved in, sliding clothes on hangers this way and that. The girl finally chose one of Raelle's better tailored black suits. She rummaged through her blouses, settling on a blue satin one that Raelle thought would match Scylla's eyes. Next, she went through the blonde shoes and insisted that Raelle wear heels. "Okay, let's talk costume. I'm not wearing a bunch of accessories." Moffat held up her hand. "I know. You have to be ready to be all bodyguardish, so Scylla wants a bird theme this year, and is wearing a masquerade ball mask of a crow, and I thought I'd bring you some similar ones for you to try. I can't have anything that's going to mess with my field of vision." I know. Moffat walked to the box that Porter had brought in and began going through the various masks. She settled on a few and turned to the blonde for her approval. The masks were relatively simple, and Raelle found herself drawn to one that had black feathers that almost shimmered blue depending on how the light hit it. The feathers weren't overly extravagant, like some of the masks, and she asked about it. "Satin bowerbird," Moffat explained. "It would actually look really good with a blouse, and I think I heard somewhere that they love the color blue." Okay. Raelle knew that she certainly loved Scylla's eyes. So, on to makeup and hair. Moffat had Raelle take a seat in the bathroom while she plugged in a curler. "I was thinking we'd go for the same style as the photo shoot. Is that all right?" Raelle nodded, and Moffat quickly styled her hair the way she wanted it. Next, she moved to the makeup, where she focused on making sure that there were plenty of blue hues that would pop through the eye holes on the mask. She worked on adding mascara and picked up a simple lip gloss. She added a little bit of shimmer to Raelle's neck and chest, and then once done, nodded her approval. Raelle finished dressing, and the girl opened a small blue velvet case. As she handed her a necklace with 2 feather pendants, one gold and one silver, Raelle looked at it curiously. "Scylla sent it over," Moffat explained. "She wanted you to have it and wear it tonight." Raelle's brow quirked, but she put on the necklace and the matching earrings. Lastly, Raelle slipped on her belt and pancake holster again to minimize the chances of people seeing her weapon. She took the mask from Moffat and raised her brows in question. "You look great, Raelle," Moffat said. The blonde bent down to pick up the cases and carry them back for the girl, but she just shook her head. "I'll have someone from the house bring everything back over later. I don't want you getting yourself messed up. Just go on out to the limo." Raelle nodded and did as she was told. As she approached the car, she could see Helen and Porter talking with one another. Both stopped and looked at the bodyguard, complete with her bowerbird mask. "Don't say a thing," Raelle warned. "I'm not saying shit," Helen said, already laughing. Porter smiled at the blonde. "You look really nice, Raelle." "Thanks," Raelle answered and got into the car. Byron and Scylla were already waiting inside, both holding bird masks in their hands. Scylla was wearing a black satin dress, and Byron was sporting a pair of black trousers, a black shirt, and a teal blazer complete with some sort of sequins. "Peacock?" Raelle guessed as she settled down across from the siblings. Byron laughed and nodded. "I wanted to go as a penguin, but Scylla wouldn't let me." Raelle turned to Scylla and quirked a brow. "No gay penguins allowed?" Scylla smiled warmly at her bodyguard. "You look wonderful, Raelle." Raelle deliberately touched her necklace and said, "Thank you, so do you." Scylla nodded and leaned forward, squeezing Raelle's hand. "Thank you for coming." Byron rolled his eyes. "Helen, let's get a move on before I get sick back here." Before Helen pulled out, though, one more guest joined them in the limo. Apparently, Garrett didn't get the bird theme memo and sat down beside Raelle, sporting a full wolf mask. She had no doubt that the evil grin on the mask matched the one on the man's face underneath it. The Terrene Theater was one of the old picture palaces built back in the late 1920s, and while they had modernized the technology, the owners had restored everything else back to its original glory. As they walked up the marble steps and through the glass double doors, Raelle paused, with the others to put on her mask. Garrett moved past them, and Raelle could only wonder what the wolf would be up to tonight. Large bronze comedy and tragedy statues stood guard at the end of a short hallway that opened up into a large 2-storied open lobby. As they walked past the statues, Raelle scanned the room and took in her surroundings. Everywhere she looked, she saw the grandeur of marble, gold, and velvet. A humongous crystal chandelier cast the room in harsh, bright lights. All around her, people flitted about dressed to the nines in ball gowns, tuxedos, and masks. Interspersed among those dressed elegantly were people in costumes ranging from seductive to macabre. She could see staff dressed in all black and simple white phantom of the opera-style masks, scurrying around with trays of drinks and hors d'oeuvres. All the masks made Raelle nervous, and she found herself subconsciously checking for her weapon. Scylla noticed the gesture and gazed at Raelle through her elaborately feathered mask. "You okay?" "Yeah," Raelle answered, offering Scylla a nervous smile. Scylla looked like she was about to say something, but the sound of her name being called from above made her and Raelle both turn toward the sound. A gorgeous, dark-haired woman dressed in something Halle Berry would have worn in Catwoman, right down to the cat mask, waved down to the musician from the top of a grand staircase. Without warning, Scylla started across the room toward the staircase, and Byron and Raelle rushed to keep up with her. The woman bounded down the stairs, and the two met at the bottom and embraced. To Raelle's absolute shock, the woman kissed Scylla on the lips, and the musician returned the kiss, and then offered the dark-haired woman additional kisses on each cheek. Raelle looked sideways at Byron and whispered, "Who is that?" "Beth Treefine, the old friend that I mentioned." "Just how good of friends," Raelle muttered, despite herself. Byron shrugged. With Scylla, you never really know. As they approached the two women, Catwoman, as Raelle was already beginning to think of her, turned to look at them and smiled. "Byron, you look as gay as ever." "I do try," Byron answered, strutting forward and giving Beth a kiss on each cheek. Raelle noticed that neither attempted a kiss on the lips. He stepped back beside Raelle and looked up at Scylla, tilting his hand in Raelle's direction. Quickly, the musician introduced Beth to Raelle. "So, this is the famous bodyguard I'm hearing so much about." Beth took her time, letting her gaze rake over the bodyguard, and then took a step forward. Without warning, she leaned in, and Raelle practically had to jerk her head to the side so that Beth's lips just missed her mouth and grazed her cheek instead. Beth stepped back, giving the woman a small pout. "Well, Raelle, if you don't mind, I'm going to take Scylla with me for a little while. She'll be perfectly safe in my hands." "I really shouldn't leave Miss Ramshorn alone," Raelle said, looking at the musician. Beth laughed loudly and stepped into the bodyguard's personal space. "Well, you can frisk me if you feel the need to check for weapons." "I can see everything I need to see from here, thanks," Raelle answered, taking a step back. "Well, that's what you bodyguards types are supposed to do, right? You like to watch, but you don't really get to touch?" Raelle's jaw clenched as she managed to release it and smile. "That's right, Miss Treefine." "Ray," Scylla said, interjecting, "I'll be fine." She gave her bodyguard a reassuring smile. "I'll see you inside the theater." Raelle reluctantly nodded, and Beth slipped a hand around Scylla's waist and led her back up the stairs. As they walked away, Raelle could hear Beth say, "Well, she's sure an upgrade from Porter." "Looks like the cat caught her crow," Byron muttered. He looked over at Raelle, his expression apologetic. "Do you mind if I mingle?" "No," Raelle answered. "I'll be fine." Raelle was not fine. She was glad for the mask, as it would at least hide some of the hurt on her face. A part of her knew she was being ridiculous. This wasn't a date, after all. She was accompanying her client on an outing with a friend. Or was Beth just a friend? And was it an outing, or was Scylla meant to be Beth's date? As the thoughts rushed through Raelle's mind, she didn't even notice the blonde dressed in a full She-Ra cosplay walk up to her and offer her a glass of champagne until it was thrust under her nose. "You look like you've lost your flock, sweetie." Raelle took the glass and looked at the woman. Thanks? I don't think bowerbirds really flock, though." The blonde laughed easily and offered a hand. "I'm Michelle." "Nice to meet you," Raelle answered politely and took the hand. "So you're with Scylla Ramshorn?" Michelle continued. Bodyguard. I'm her bodyguard," Raelle answered. "Actually, I'm working now." She gestured to the glass. "Thanks for this, though." Michelle shrugged, disappointment apparent, but took the cue to leave gracefully and sauntered back into the crowd. Raelle forced herself to focus on her duty instead of wondering about what Scylla was doing with Beth. She walked the perimeter of the room, noting the various exits and inner rooms. After surveying the bottom floor, she headed up the staircase and made her rounds there. As she mingled, she finally caught sight of Scylla and Beth coming out of a door marked private, staff only. Her jaw clenched at the intimacy with which Beth was still touching Scylla every chance she got. She watched as the two ladies made their way across the room and was surprised to realize that they were walking in her direction. Raelle held her ground, waiting for them to walk the final few feet. "Well, Raelle, here you go," Beth said as she stopped in front of her. "Scylla's all safe and sound and yours." Catwoman turned to Scylla and pecked her cheek. "I'll catch you again at the intermission." Scylla nodded stiffly. "Sure, Beth." Raelle noticed that Scylla didn't return the kiss. She looked down at Scylla, pale blue eyes studying the musician's cerulean ones. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just peachy," Scylla nodded. "I could use a drink, though." Raelle nodded and grabbed a glass from a passing tray and handed it to the brunette. Her brow rose from behind her mask as the brunette tipped it back and drained the drink in one go. Scylla handed the empty glass back to Raelle. "I should visit the ladies' room before we go inside. We've only got a few minutes." Raelle nodded and gestured toward the nearest restroom. She watched as Scylla made her way to the door. A few minutes later, after the musician had returned, they tracked down Byron and made their way into the theater. The space was as ornately decorated as the outer rooms, and Raelle couldn't help but be impressed by how elegant everything looked. The room was cold, though, and as they took their seats and removed their masks, Raelle could see Scylla shiver beside her, and she removed her suit jacket, draping it over the musician's bare legs. "Thank you," Scylla whispered, as the lights in the theater flashed a warning. A moment later, the theater went dark, save a lone spotlight on the stage. A man wearing an old-fashioned tuxedo, completed with a top hat, walked out from behind large red velvet curtains that were trimmed in gold. He had on makeup that made him resemble Pennywise, the dancing clown, and even had on white gloves and blood-red shoes. As the spotlight fixed on him, he began to speak. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and hello witches and demons and heroes and villains. I am your host, Mycroft Waxwell. We are honored here tonight to be among some of the best and brightest in their arts. For over 15 years, the Tareem Theater has played host to our little underground film festival." Behind him, the curtains were pulled back to reveal a large screen, and as he spoke, images began to flash behind him. "We delight in unconventional stories, nightmarish dreamscapes, and the macabre. Tonight's films will shock you. They will frighten you. They may make you laugh. And they might even sicken you. But I promise that they will leave you changed." Beside her, Scylla shivered again, and Raelle looked over at the musician. She could see Scylla's obvious discomfort. She wasn't sure if it was the gruesome horror images that had flashed on the screen, or the temperature of the room that made her so uncomfortable. A part of her wondered if it had something to do with Beth Treefine, and that thought and the jealousy it sparked deep down somewhere in Raelle's core more than anything else spurred her to slide her hand beneath the jacket and let her fingers run along the top of Scylla's bare leg and push the fabric of her dress up. The brunette stiffened beneath her touch, then slid her own hand under the jacket, grasping Raelle's hand and squeezing it tightly. Raelle bit her lip and puffed out a breath, but put her attention back to the man on stage. He continued on for several minutes, talking about past festivals and thanking this donor and that contributor. Eventually, he introduced some of the staff, and as Beth came onto the stage, Raelle felt Scylla stiffen again. Raelle leaned over, whispering in Scylla's ear, "Are you sure you're okay?" Scylla didn't speak for a moment, then let go of Raelle's hand. She put her mouth close to Raelle's ear, her breath tickling the blonde's neck, and said simply, "Distract me." "Sure you don't want her to distract you?" Raelle asked, nodding at the woman on the stage. As soon as the words came out of her mouth, she regretted it. She watched Scylla's jaw clench beside her, and the brunette shifted away from her. "Fine." Raelle sighed and looked back up at the stage. There, the staff of the festival made their closing comments and exited the stage right as Maxwell introduced the first film. He stepped down, and the movie started. As the opening credits flashed on the screen, Raelle started to move her hand, but was stopped by Scylla grabbing at her wrist and guiding her hand between her legs as she shifted back towards the blonde. "Distract me," the musician repeated, and this time her voice sounded like a plea. Raelle felt her pulse quicken, and as Scylla uncrossed her legs, the blonde shifted her position, letting her hand brush across the singer's center. Raelle heard Scylla's sharp intake of breath, and as she exhaled, Raelle let her hand move again, her fingers touching the musician's over her underwear. She could feel the heat coming off of the brunette in waves. On the screen, the movie played. Something about an escort service for vampires, and Raelle continued moving her hand until Scylla was trembling under her. She turned slightly towards the musician, leaning into her, and whispered, "Distracted yet?" Scylla whispered in Raelle's ear, "I want you inside me." The confession made the blonde shudder. Quickly, her eyes darted around the theater, seeing everyone else's gaze glued to the screen. She shifted her hand, pushing Scylla's underwear to the side. As her fingers teased the brunette's entrance, she had to bite back a moan at how wet she was. Scylla shifted in her seat, pressing against Raelle's hand, and the blonde moved her fingers inside of her. Raelle watched as Scylla bit back a moan. She slid her fingers in and out, watching the brunette and listening for the slightest shift in her breath. They couldn't have timed it better if they had tried. At a particularly loud part in the movie, with some witless blonde on the screen yelling at the top of her lungs after finding her boyfriend dead, Scylla climaxed and went limp in the seat beside Raelle. Raelle shuddered in the seat beside the brunette. The musician may have had her release, but Raelle was uncomfortably on edge. Touching Scylla, bringing her pleasure, it all threatened to overwhelm her senses completely. She leaned over, kissing the brunette on the cheek before leaning back in her own seat, eyes closed, attempting to drone out the noise of the film. Beside her, Scylla shifted, leaning her head on the bodyguard's shoulder. Neither noticed the man in the wolf mask watching them from across the room. When the film came to an end and the lights came back on, Scylla sat up and looked over at Rael with a smirk. Her pupils were still blown, and Rael swallowed at the sight of the woman before her. Scylla leaned over and kissed Rael on the cheek. She stood up, handing the blonde her suit jacket, and looked down at her bodyguard. "We've got a 30-minute intermission, and I know a place we can go." She reached out a hand and Rael took it, nearly stumbling to her feet. As they walked to the same door that Scylla had emerged from with Beth earlier, Rael hesitated and looked at Scylla. The brunette shrugged and tapped the code on the keypad. "I watched Beth enter the code earlier." She walked in the room and looked back at her bodyguard expectantly. Rael swallowed and followed her inside, closing the door behind her. She barely had time to take in the small office before Scylla was on her. Rael wanted to stop Scylla. She wanted to ask the brunette what the hell she'd been doing with Beth in the first place. She wanted to know if they had done exactly what Scylla was doing now, which was pressing Rael against a closed door. But Rael didn't ask. Instead, she let the brunette kiss her, let her trail hot kisses down her neck, and let her unbuckle the belt on her pants with a small clink. As Scylla brushed her thumb over Rael's clit, the blonde felt her mind empty of everything but the siren in front of her. As her eyes started to roll back in head, Scylla's voice brought her eyes back into focus. "Let me take care of you." She met Scylla's gaze, and could see the brunette only had Rael on her mind. After leaving the small office and cleaning up in the restroom, they barely had time to grab drinks before heading back into the theater. As they walked by a table set up at the entrance, Rael grabbed a couple of bags of popcorn for them, and they reached their seats just as the lights began to flash. Maxwell took the stage again and introduced the next film. The two opened their bags of popcorn and began to munch as the opening credits started to roll. Thank goodness the film was a farce, and Rael and Scylla both found themselves laughing at the antics on the screen. When the show came to an end, Rael stretched out her legs and looked over at the brunette. "How much more do we have tonight?" "Just one more show," Scylla said. Rael reluctantly got up and reached a hand out for Scylla. The brunette took it and stood up beside the blonde. They both donned their masks again as they walked out into the lobby. Scylla slipped her arm in Rael's and let her head rest on the side of her bodyguard's shoulder. "Tired?" Rael asked. "You wore me out," Scylla said, lightly chuckling. She stifled a yawn and watched as Beth made her way over to them. "Well, what do you think so far?" Beth asked, looking back and forth between the two glowing women. Scylla smiled at her friend. "It's off to a great start." "Good. I'm just sorry you won't be able to attend the other nights." The brunette nodded. "I know. But Garrett's got my schedule so full I can barely breathe." "Yup, well, that's what happens when you go winning awards and trying for more." Beth stopped a waiter and grabbed some drinks for them. "I overheard Garrett talking to Maxwell. He said he'd wagered you'd win an Oscar by next year." Scylla snorted. "I don't know about that." "Yeah, well, we'll see. I always knew you had it in you." "Thank you, Beth. You've always been extremely talented, too." Beth smiled at the compliment. "I'm working on it. I've got to get back inside for the last show. I hope you enjoy it." "Is it your film?" Rael asked politely. "Yeah, it is. Hopefully it will help end the night with a bang." Beth leaned in, kissing Scylla on the cheek. This time, the musician kissed her back. Before Beth could try to kiss her, Rael took matters into her own hands and mimicked Scylla, kissing the woman's other cheek. Beth returned the gesture and beamed at Rael. "Well, Rael, it was lovely to meet you. Take care of this one." "I will," Rael answered, slipping an arm around Scylla's waist. Beth's smiles faltered for just a fraction of a second, and then nodded and headed off towards the theater. "You gonna tell me about what happened between you two tonight?" Rael asked Scylla as she watched the dark-haired Catwoman go. Scylla nodded. The short version? Nothing happened, and that was a problem for her. Rael looked into Scylla's eyes for a moment and then nodded. "You two used to be close?" "That was a long time ago. We were friends, Ray, nothing more." "And now?" "And now I'm in a position to help her career." "Will you?" Rael asked. Scylla shrugged. "I don't know yet." She smiled and looked up at the bodyguard. "But someone recently told me I should focus on doing the best good I could do each day." Rael smiled at the musician. "Ready to go back for the final show?" "Yeah," Scylla answered, as she walked with Rael back into the theater. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.